Hi everyone. So we always know and talk about how the Torah portions seem to speak to whatever we need to hear right when we need to hear it. Now in this past week's portion, we hear about the revelation at Mount Sinai, but before the portion gets to that, there's this story of Yitro, of Jethro. A lot of people try to figure out, why do we need to hear about his judicial reform that he's teaching Moshe before receiving the Torah? But I want to go a step back and ask an even earlier question. The portion starts by telling us that Yitro brings back Tzipporah and Moshe's sons, Gershom and Eliezer. Now, there are a bunch of weird things here. First of all, we didn't even know they ever left. Last we saw them was in the hotel on the way back to Egypt, so apparently we're finding out now they left at some point. And then the Torah tells us not only their names, but goes to the trouble of mentioning the meaning and reason behind their names, which is both repetitive in the case of Gershom, Moshe's older son, because we already knew the reason for his name, and it's also seemingly out of place. Usually names are explained at birth. It seems superfluous now as well. Like, why are their names even important to tell us that they brought them? We could just say, brought Moshe's sons. I think that to understand this, you have to try for a moment to get into the mindset of the family drama that's going on here. When Moshe leaves his father-in-law, he doesn't tell him the full story. Honestly, we don't know if he ever gave him a full story about the reasons that he ended up in Midian to begin with. He just says to Yitro, I want to go back to Egypt and check on my brothers, see how they're doing. Now, at some point, Tzipporah goes back to her parents' house and takes the kids with her. Now, imagine what kind of conversation was happening between Tzipporah and her dad. It's like, you remember Moshe? So he heard God, it turns out, and he wants to go to Pharaoh. He thinks he's going to bring down the world's most powerful empire and save the Jews. Oh, yeah. What do you think Yitro is thinking? My son-in-law is a mental patient. I'm going to have to raise my grandsons as my own children. That's like the likely scenario, right? You can then imagine just like this sad family tragedy, and he's raising these children, and one day he sits with the newspaper in the morning and he sees Moses leads Jews out of Egypt. Pharaoh dies at sea. And now imagine he's sitting there and he's looking down at these two grandsons sitting on his lap. One is named Gershom, which means stranger in a strange land, and one is named Eliezer, which means God saved me from the hands of Pharaoh. Now, he's looking down at these boys. If you had to put the entire Exodus story in a nutshell, it basically is, we were strangers in a strange land, and Hashem saved us from the hands of Paro. He's looking down at these little grandsons named, I was a stranger in a strange land, and Hashem saved me from Pharaoh. And then these are stories that we tell and retell through every generation. Hashem, we were strangers in a strange land, so we have to be kind to strangers. Hashem saved us from the hands of Pharaoh, so we have countless reminders and garments and holidays and Shabbat to remind us that Hashem saved us from Pharaoh. So he's looking down at these grandsons and he sees in them that he is, these children that he was raising as patriotic Midianites are actually part of a grand historic story of Jewish redemption. And suddenly he realizes, maybe they have a good life here in Midian. They can pretend to be Midianites. They can try to fit in, but they can't really escape that they're not just individuals, but part of something larger. Now, what is marvelous about the Torah and Jewish destiny is that every person lives and relives and in their life every part of the Torah in our own personal lives. We all have moments of slavery, feeling foreign, feeling strange, and moments where Hashem lifts us out and we feel like we were saved. The Torah, every single story in the Torah is applicable to every person as a microcosm of the greater story inside their own personal life. Just like every cell in your body has the DNA of the entire body, it functions on its own, but it has everything encoded in the DNA inside of it, but it's also part of this larger body. And so Yitro comes and says, these guys can't keep growing up in Midian. They are part of the Jewish story. Yeah, maybe the Jewish story isn't perfect. Maybe those Jews can use some tweaking of their legal system, but he realizes where his grandsons belong and he steps out and returns them. And the Torah is telling this to us, because you cannot live your life completely without attaching yourself to the Jewish story as it unfolds. If you are a Jew, you cannot be separate from the Jewish story. Normally in a war, people run away. In Israel, I think we're probably the only country that in a state of war actually increases demand for Aliyah. The Jewish Agency just reported that since the war started, there was a 94% increase for Aliyah requests in America, 147% in Canada, 380% in France, and other places as well. What in the world would drive people to run to a war zone with bombs falling and people hiding in shelters? Why? Now, if you look down at yourself and your children, you say, am I actually going to sit here and let the story unfold without me. The Jewish people were strangers in a strange land, in Auschwitz, in Iraq, in Ethiopia, in the Soviet Union. Hashem took us out of those strange lands and saved us and brought us to Israel, and I'm going to sit somewhere else. Now, what's interesting is that Yitro doesn't just put them on a train and send them. By watching the Jewish story, he as a Gentile is also inspired. He is inspired to question the idolatrous teachings that he grew up with. He starts asking questions, and he finds a way to attach himself, to help the Jewish people, to enrich them with his knowledge and his life experience, and to give to them. And we know that in later generations, the traditions tell us that Yael will come from him and save the Jews from Sisera entirely. So he is able to then also stand up alongside the Jewish people and make a mark for us in our history. So when we look at this beginning of the Parsha of Yitro, it's not a distraction from the redemption process. It seems like it's, we have leaving Egypt and then we should go straight to getting the Torah. It's not a distraction. It's not like the Torah lost track of time and just got off, went off on a tangent. The Torah is telling us that an integral part of the redemption process that will repeat itself in future generations, that we need to know for future generations, an integral part of that is that people who at one time felt that they were just separate individuals living comfortably wherever they are going to see the Jewish story, look down at themselves and see that they are part of a larger story and cannot continue to be separate from that. And that is something that the Torah makes sure that we need to know before we can actually come to Har Sinai and have the completion of this process of really leaving Egypt and becoming the Jewish people. There needs to be this rejoining of everyone together and everyone realizing that they cannot be separate from the most incredible story ever told. So with that, I wish us all a good week of living out the Torah in our own personal lives and joining our lives to the greater miracle that is the redemption of Am Yisrael. Bye, guys.